Reid Calloway had a system for mornings, and the system worked because he'd built it to leave no room for anything unexpected. 5:30 alarm. Coffee measured to the exact same line on the same mug. Noah's lunch packed the night before, so mornings didn't require decisions, only execution. He moved through the kitchen the way a man moves through a space he's memorized in the dark, which he had more than once when Noah had a bad dream, and Reid spent the remainder of the night on the couch rather than risk waking him going back to bed. This particular Tuesday in October, the coffee was done before the sky showed any color at all. Reid stood at the counter looking at the refrigerator the way he sometimes did without meaning to, not at the lopsided crayon drawing of two figures Noah had labeled Dad and Me in the careful print of a kid who'd just learned how letters worked, not at the soccer schedule running through the end of November, but at the small piece of paper held there by a magnet shaped like a baseball. The paper had been folded and unfolded enough times that the creases had gone soft. He'd written the list the night Dara sat down across from him at this same kitchen table and told him she was leaving, not because she didn't love him, but because loving him felt like standing at a full stop while the rest of the world kept moving. He'd written the list because he needed to do something with his hands while she talked, and what he wrote were things he'd been meaning to want. Goals, plans, the architecture of a life he kept meaning to build. He had not looked at that list since the night he wrote it. He wasn't looking at it now exactly. He was just aware of it the way you're aware of a window in a room. You don't stare at it, but you always know where the light's coming from. The lunch was already packed. He checked anyway. Turkey on wheat, the crusts cut off because Noah had decided at age 5 that crusts were a personal offense and Reid had decided that particular battle was not worth the morning energy. Apple slices in a separate container so they didn't make the bread soggy. He reached to the back of the cabinet above the sink, past the mug his sister Marin had given him that read "World's Okayest Brother," and found the small velociraptor figurine Noah had left there 2 nights ago after carrying it from room to room during an elaborate narrated hunt across the downstairs. Reid set it on top of the lunch container. Nobody asked him to. Nobody would see him do it. His phone lit up on the counter. Dara's name, 7:15 in the morning. The text read, "Noah left his jacket here. He'll need it this week." No greeting, no punctuation at the end, which was how Dara texted when she was being efficient rather than unkind. The distinction had taken him a year to learn and another year to stop needing to figure out. He didn't reply. He opened the closet near the front door, took out the backup jacket he'd started keeping there in September when the temperature started doing what it always did in the Midwest, changed its mind every 48 hours, and folded it into Noah's backpack. Problem solved before Noah knew it was a problem. That was the whole game most days. Noah came downstairs at 6:40 with the specific kind of energy that 7-year-olds produce when they have slept perfectly and have not yet been asked to do anything they don't want to do. His hair was pointing in 3 directions. He was already talking about whether the feathered dinosaur theory changed the way paleontologists thought about cold-blooded versus warm-blooded classifications, a topic he'd been working through for several days, and Reid listened with the attentiveness he'd trained himself to bring to these conversations. Because the worst thing he could imagine was Noah noticing the moment his father stopped actually listening and started performing it. If they were warm-blooded, Noah continued climbing into his chair at the table while Reid put cereal in front of him. Then they were way more like birds than anyone thought, which means T-Rex was basically just a really big pigeon. A really big pigeon that could eat a car. Well, yeah, but still. Noah considered this seriously, spoon halfway to his mouth. Does that make them less scary or more scary? Reid thought about it genuinely. Both. Noah appeared satisfied with this answer and applied himself to his cereal. Reid drank his coffee standing up, which was how he always drank it because sitting down in the mornings felt like declaring the day had started in a way he wasn't ready to commit to until Noah was fed and dressed and the specific chaos of the next hour was navigated. He watched his son eat. He did this without, he hoped, looking like he was watching. Noah was 7 years old and had already developed the instinct to find parental scrutiny deeply uncool, which Reid respected, though it had required adjustments. In the car, 15 minutes later, Noah was quiet for the first time all morning. Not asleep quiet, the other kind, the kind that meant something was working its way to the surface. Reid had learned to wait for these rather than prompt them, because prompting sometimes sent them back down for days. They were stopped at a red light 3 blocks from Eastfield Elementary when it came, "Dad, if you liked someone but you were scared they'd leave, would you still like them?" Reid kept his eyes on the light. "Where's that coming from?" "There's a squirrel in the yard at school." Noah's tone was completely matter-of-fact, the way he delivered all his actual feelings wrapped in the nearest available animal fact. "I've been bringing pieces of my granola bar for it for 2 weeks. It keeps coming closer, but then it runs away. But I keep bringing the granola bar." The light changed. Reid pulled forward. He thought about several answers, found all of them inadequate, and said nothing for a moment that lasted just long enough for Noah to glance at him. "I think that's brave," Reid finally said. "Bringing the granola bar anyway." Noah looked out the window. "I just don't want to eat alone." Reid didn't answer that one. He didn't know how to answer it in a way that was honest without being more than a 7-year-old should have to carry. And Noah was already climbing out of the car with his backpack, the velociraptor bumping against his side through the fabric of the lunch bag. The Mercer consulting offices occupied the top 3 floors of a building on West Randolph Street, with a lobby that smelled like expensive coffee and strategic ambition. Reid had worked there for 3 years. He knew where the good printer was, which elevator ran slow on Mondays, and that the espresso machine on the 14th floor made a sound like a dying transmission about 30 seconds before it actually died. Enough warning to switch to the one on 13. He knew the building the way you know any place you've spent that much time, which is to say he knew its habits and its shortcuts and its particular brands of dysfunction, and he had built himself a functional professional life inside it, without, he was fairly certain, causing anyone any serious trouble. He had also in 3 years attended exactly 0 happy hours, 1 company picnic at which he arrived 90 minutes late and left after 45 minutes, because Noah had a low-grade fever, and the mandatory all-hands meeting every quarter in which Sloane Mercer stood at the front of the room and delivered an address that was equal parts data and conviction in a combination Reid had never seen anyone else achieve without one undermining the other. He had not thought about Sloane Mercer in any context other than professional necessity. He would have said simply, not in the business of thinking about his CEO in any personal capacity, and this was a position he'd held without difficulty for 3 years, because the structure of the company made it easy. She existed on the 15th floor and in conference rooms and in emails that were always clear, always necessary, and never one word longer than they needed to be. He was on the 14th floor, and the distance between those floors had always seemed, practically speaking, absolute. He was at his desk reviewing the third-quarter transition plan for the Henderson account at 9:10 when his direct manager Phil Darrow appeared at the edge of his workspace wearing an expression Reid had learned to categorize as, "This is slightly awkward, but I need you to do it anyway. You have dinner plans tonight." "I have Noah until 6:30, then he goes to Marin's." "So, after 6:30. Phil." "It's not a work thing." Phil set his coffee down on the corner of Reid's desk, which he only did when he was settling in for a conversation rather than conducting one in passing. "Someone asked me to pass along an invitation. Dinner tonight, 8 o'clock. Order the place on Fulton. I'm told the reservation's already made." Reid looked at him. "You're setting me up on a blind date. I am facilitating an arrangement that was requested of me by someone I respect and that I think you should take seriously." Phil picked up his coffee. "Don't cancel, I mean that." Reid spent the rest of the morning intermittently drafting a polite cancellation text to the number Phil had given him and deleting it. He drafted it 4 times. The 4th time he got as far as, "Sorry. Something came up with my son," before he stopped and sat with his hand hovering over the send button and thought about Noah saying, "I just don't want to eat alone," which was an unfair memory to have at this particular moment, and accomplished nothing except making him feel like the message he was about to send said more about him than it did about his schedule. He didn't send it. He dropped Noah at Marin's at 6:40. His sister met him at the door in the particular way she had when she knew something and was choosing her timing, already smiling, but holding it back, which was Marin's tell and had been since they were kids. "Big night," she said. "I don't know anything about tonight except the address." That's the most romantic thing you've said in 3 years. It's not romantic, Marin, it's a dinner I didn't cancel. Which for you is the same thing. She took Noah's overnight bag from his hand. Noah had already disappeared into the house in the direction of what sounded like a Lego construction project of significant ambition. Marin tilted her head the way she did when she was about to say something she meant. Reid, you've been running the same route for 3 years. Same job, same grocery store, same Tuesday night pizza with Noah. The road is fine. But you're not fine, I mean. You're functional. Those aren't the same thing. Reid looked at his sister for a moment. The restaurant's on Fulton. I know. She was already closing the door. Text me. Our door was the kind of place that understood how to make a room feel private without actually giving anyone privacy. Low lighting distributed so that every table sat inside its own small sphere of warmth. The noise of other conversations present but blurred into something that functioned as privacy without providing it. Reid arrived 3 minutes early, which was his default, and gave his name to the host who led him toward a corner table without checking any list. He saw her before he understood what he was seeing. Sloane Mercer was seated at the corner table in a gray dress that was not a work dress, her hair down in a way he had never seen it, and she was looking directly at him with the expression she wore in the 30 seconds before a board meeting started, not anticipatory, not anxious, simply present in a way that did not leave much room for the world to surprise her. Reid stopped walking. Not dramatically, his feet simply paused while the rest of him caught up to the information his eyes were delivering. The host had already pulled out the chair across from her. There was nowhere else to be. He sat down. He had in 3 years been in the same room as Sloane Mercer approximately 40 times. In those 40 times he had formed specific impressions that he'd never had cause to revise. She was precise, she was efficient. She had a quality of attention that made the person she was focusing on feel simultaneously important and slightly accountable for everything they were about to say. In quarterly reviews, she cited numbers from memory. In the one meeting where Reid had pushed back on her assessment of the Detroit logistics contract, spending a weekend building a counter-analysis, he was not at all certain she would receive the way he intended. She had asked 3 questions, each one targeted at the weakest structural point in his argument, and then told him he was right and restructured the contract. He had spent the following week expecting some form of professional consequence and received none. He had not thought about any of this in terms of personal significance until this exact moment when it was suddenly relevant in a way that rearranged everything. Sloane, he said, not a question. Reid. She leaned back slightly, and there was the corner of something in her expression that wasn't amusement, but was in the same neighborhood. You look like you're running the geometry on whether the emergency exit is closer than it appears. I'm deciding whether to be angry or impressed. You can be both. I find most worthwhile things produce that reaction initially. A server materialized beside them, unhurried, impeccably trained. Sloane ordered a bottle of something Reid didn't catch the name of, and the tasting menu without looking at the card, and the server was gone as efficiently as he'd arrived. Reid kept his hands flat on the table. You arranged a blind date with your own employee and then sat here waiting to see if he'd show up. I arranged a dinner with someone I've been trying to find a reason to talk to outside of a professional context for 4 months. The blind date structure was necessary because you would have said no to anything that looked like what it actually was. Which is what? She looked at him with those gray eyes that reminded him suddenly and inconveniently of Lake Michigan on the kind of October morning when the clouds are low and the water looks like it goes on forever. An honest conversation between 2 people who've both gotten very good at not having those. Reid said nothing for a moment. The restaurant moved gently around them, the percussion of cutlery, someone laughing 2 tables over, the kind of jazz that served as audio texture rather than music. Phil Darrow called this a favor, Reid said. He looked pained about it. Phil has known me for 11 years. He's familiar with the look on my face when I've made a decision and I'm not going to unmake it. What about the look on your face when you're wrong? He's familiar with that too. Her chin tilted a degree. He'd tell you it's rarer but more interesting. The first course arrived, something delicate and expensive that Reid looked at without tasting for a moment. Sloane waited. He recognized this as a deliberate quality, the ability to wait without filling silence, which was rarer than it should have been, and which he found against his better judgment deeply settling. 4 months, he said. You challenged the Detroit contract assessment in February. I'd noticed you before that, but February was when I started paying attention differently. She picked up her fork with the unhurried confidence of someone who had made peace with taking up space. You'd reviewed the logistics data over the weekend. You came into that room having done work nobody asked you to do, and you stood behind it without apologizing for it. You treated me like someone who was wrong rather than someone who was the CEO. I find that happens approximately never. It happened to be worth the risk. Every right position involves risk. The question is whether the person taking it knows that going in. Reid looked at her across the table and recognized with the particular clarity that sometimes arrived at inconvenient moments that this was a more complicated situation than he'd had the resources to prepare for. He had imagined during the drive here something awkward and politely survived. He had not imagined anything remotely like this. Why the theater? He gestured vaguely at the restaurant. You're my CEO. You could have found any number of direct ways to have a conversation. Direct ways involve power dynamics that make honest conversation harder, not easier. Here, I'm not your CEO. I'm a woman who'd like to have dinner with someone she thinks is worth knowing. She paused, and something shifted in her expression fractionally, but Reid caught it. I am aware this involved a level of orchestration that some people would find presumptuous. Some people would find it slightly alarming. Some people would be right. She reached for her water glass. I should tell you Phil wasn't the only thing I put in place before tonight. I filed a disclosure with HR before I made this reservation. Reid set his fork down. You filed paperwork for a dinner that hadn't happened yet. I'm thorough. You filed paperwork before asking whether I wanted to have dinner with you. I filed paperwork because I was going to ask you to have dinner with me, and when that resulted in dinner, I wanted the professional record to be clean before the personal situation had the chance to become complicated. He stared at her. She met his gaze with the equanimity of someone who had thought through the counter-arguments and found them insufficient. I don't know, he said finally, whether that's the most controlling thing I've ever heard or the most responsible. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more honest than one. I've been told it's frequently both. The conversation that followed did not resemble any version of itself he'd anticipated. They talked about the company, the way people talk about something they've each built differently inside their heads. He'd come in 3 years ago as a mid-level analyst and grown the position through quarterly reports and project management and the kind of incremental credibility that accumulates when you simply keep being right about things. She had founded Mercer Consulting 11 years earlier with a business plan, a line of credit, and the specific breed of stubbornness that, in retrospect, everyone calls vision. They talked about Chicago. She'd moved here from the East Coast a year before launching. The company arrived knowing essentially no one learned the city the way she appeared to learn everything, which was systematically and without sentimentality until it became hers. He told her about Noah without meaning to, which was to say he answered one question she asked about his schedule and found himself 3 minutes later having explained the Velociraptor taxonomy conversation from the car and the backup jacket system and the particular quality of silence Noah got when something was working its way to the surface. Sloane listened with the quality of attention he recognized from conference rooms, and it felt applied to this like being seen from a distance that was still somehow accurate. He sounds like someone who thinks carefully about things he doesn't say, she said. He says everything. He just wraps it in a dinosaur first. Something in her expression softened at the edges quickly enough that he might have imagined it. Later, the third course between them, the restaurant emptied by increments around them into the particular intimacy of a late table, she said, I want to ask you something and I'd like an honest answer rather than a diplomatic one. Go ahead. When was the last time you did something that wasn't for Noah for the job or against the grain of your own caution? Reid looked at his wine glass. The question sat in the air with a weight that it had clearly been carrying for a while, before she asked it, not directed at him specifically, but at some understanding she'd arrived at, and was now testing in a new direction. When I took on the Detroit contract counter-analysis, he said, that was for the job. It was also against my own caution, considerably. She considered this. Okay, that counts. Why are you asking? Sloane set down her fork in the precise way of someone making space for something they're going to say carefully. Because I've been watching you operate at Mercer for 3 years, and what I see is a man who is exceptionally good at keeping every part of his life running without any of the parts touching each other. You are present for your son, you are excellent at your job, and you have constructed a very functional distance between those two things and everything else. She looked at him. I recognize that construction. I built the same one. Mine just has more floors. Reid absorbed this. He wanted to disagree on principle and couldn't locate the specific point on which to do it. My ex-wife left because I chose stability over ambition, he said. It wasn't what he'd planned to say. It came out of whatever the conversation had loosened in him that he hadn't noticed loosening. Her word. I thought I was choosing a sustainable life. She thought I'd stopped moving. We were both right about what we were describing. We just weren't describing the same problem. Sloane didn't offer any of the things people normally offered in response to that kind of disclosure, reassurance, shared outrage, the particular brand of empathy that's really just redirection. She simply held it. And since then, she said, since then I've been very good at keeping everything running. Everything except the list on your refrigerator. He looked up sharply. She held his gaze without apology. I was at your desk last spring reviewing the Henderson preliminary numbers. Your laptop was open on the shared drive. Behind it there was a photo Noah had drawn, the one of the two of you by the lake. And there was a grocery list on a sticky note that had another list behind it, the corner of it showing folded over. I didn't read it, but I could see it had been handled many times and never thrown away. Reid was quiet for a moment. That's a significant amount of attention. I told you, I pay attention. To your senior analyst's refrigerator magnets. To the things people keep that they won't look at but can't let go of. She turned her wine glass in her hand. I have a version of mine. It's a voice message I've never deleted and never played again. Different object, same function. The check appeared without them requesting it. Sloane paid before Reid could reach for his wallet, and when he started to object, she said simply, I invited you. I filed the paperwork. I'm expensing this to executive strategy. That's genuinely inappropriate. I know. Accounting will send me a very politely worded memo. Outside October had sharpened into the particular cold that comes off the lake and means business. The street was quieter than it had been when he arrived the city, doing what it always did after 10 o'clock, redistributing rather than stopping. They stood on the sidewalk with their breath faintly visible, and the restaurant's lights behind them, and all the reasonable, professional, structurally sensible things about the situation arranged themselves clearly in Reid's mind, like a ledger column that added up correctly and still felt like the wrong answer. This is a significant complication, he said. Most things worth doing have structural complications. You're my CEO. Technically, there are about 8 ways this ends professionally. There are also ways it doesn't. She looked at him with a directness that was simply how she existed in the world. Not a performance of confidence, but the actual thing underneath it. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm asking whether there's enough here to warrant another conversation. Reid thought about the last 2 hours. He thought about the specific quality of attention she'd paid him when he talked about Noah, and the way she'd named the thing on his refrigerator without flinching from it, and the fact that she'd admitted to a voice message she couldn't delete and couldn't play with the same matter-of-fact honesty she brought to quarterly projections. And he thought that those 3 things together constituted a kind of information about a person that he hadn't received about anyone in a long time. There's enough, he said. She nodded once the way she did when a decision had been made that didn't need further ceremony. She started toward the parking structure at the end of the block, then paused. Reid. She said his name the way she said everything, direct, no extra weight, which somehow gave it more. Thank you for not canceling. She walked to her car. The taillights disappeared around the corner. He stood in the cold air for a moment longer than was practical, the city moving around him in its indifferent way, and became aware that he was against all reasonable expectation smiling. His phone buzzed. "Maren. How'd it go?" Not a question. He typed, "Complicated." Hit send. Her response arrived in seconds. Good complicated or bad complicated? He looked at the question for a moment before he answered. He thought about the ledger he'd mentally drawn up, the 8 professional complications, the distance between the 14th and 15th floors that had always seemed absolute, and the way none of those things had made the 2 hours feel like anything other than the most interesting conversation he'd had in longer than he could specifically place. "Not sure yet," he typed back. "But I'm not calculating the emergency exit anymore." He was still moving through something he couldn't name when he got in the car. It wasn't the giddy, airless feeling of early infatuation, which he remembered from his 20s as a kind of specific, pleasant stupidity. This was something slower and stranger, a feeling of having taken a step that was irreversible, not because the ground had changed, but because he had, and he wasn't entirely certain when it happened. He drove through the night city and thought about a list on a refrigerator that he'd written 3 years ago and never opened. He thought about a woman who paid attention to everything and had paid attention to him and whom he had spoken to for 2 hours without performing a single thing, which was something he couldn't say about any conversation he'd had in recent memory, including most of his conversations with his own sister. He thought about Noah bringing granola bar pieces to a squirrel that kept running away and doing it anyway, because some form of company was worth the repeated risk of its disappearance. He picked up his phone at the next red light and looked at Sloane's name in his contacts. She'd had Phil enter it before the dinner, which was extremely her, and typed, "I had a good time tonight." Then he put the phone down. 3 blocks from his apartment it buzzed. "Same time next week." He looked at it. Around him the street was quiet. The neighborhood settled into its nighttime configuration lights in windows above storefronts, a couple walking a dog with the specific resignation of people doing this because the dog required it rather than because the night was pleasant. He typed, "Yes," and drove the rest of the way home with the city around him, and something in his chest that he recognized after a moment's examination as the thing that happens when a door you'd stopped expecting to open moves. At Maren's, Noah was already in the guest room when Reid arrived. He could hear the white noise machine through the closed door. Maren met him in the kitchen with tea she hadn't asked if he wanted, and the look of someone who had questions and was deciding which order to ask them in. "Well," she set the mug in front of him, "I'll tell you everything. Not tonight." "Was it someone I know?" He looked at his sister. "Remember how you said the route was fine, but I wasn't—" "Reid, it was not someone you know." He picked up the mug. "But she knew about the list on the refrigerator." Maren stared at him. "You've been keeping that from everyone for 3 years." "I know." "How did she—" "She pays attention." A silence in which Maren processed this. "Then, that's either deeply impressive or deeply alarming." He thought about the drive over. "She said it's frequently both." He went down the short hallway to the guest room and opened the door a crack. Noah was asleep on his side dinosaur pajamas, one arm around a stuffed animal that was technically a shark but had been adopted into the dinosaur collection on grounds that were apparently satisfactory to Noah's internal classification system. His face in sleep was the version of his face that Reid found most impossible to look away from, all the performance of the day gone, just the actual person breathing. Reid stood in the doorway for longer than he needed to. He thought about what Sloane had said. "You've built a very functional distance between those 2 things and everything else," and recognized that she was right, and that she'd said it not with criticism, but with the recognition of someone who had built the same architecture by different methods for different reasons, and that this was either the most convenient or the most dangerous thing they had in common, and he wasn't yet sure which. He turned off the light in the hallway and went to find a place to be not quite asleep for the next several hours, which was what passed for rest on nights when something had shifted and he hadn't yet found the floor of the new level. His phone sat on the nightstand. The last message thread showed, "Same time next week." Below it, "Yes." He turned it face down. He lay in the dark and listened to the sound of the city, which at this hour was mostly traffic and distance, and let himself stay inside the specific, unfamiliar feeling of having said yes to something he didn't have a protocol for. He'd had a system for mornings. He had not had one for this. He found, for the first time in 3 years, that the absence of a system felt less like exposure than like the specific kind of open space that exists right before something is built inside it. He didn't sleep for a long time. He didn't mind. 3 weeks is not enough time to know someone. It is, however, enough time to recognize the shape of them, the way they move through a room, the specific quality of their silences, the things they reach for when they're thinking. Reid had learned Sloane's shape the way you learn a new building first, the exits, then the rooms, then the details that only appear once you've stopped looking for them. She texted efficiently the same way she emailed, no preamble, no trailing pleasantries, information delivered and complete. She was 20 minutes early to everything and filled the waiting time with work she'd pulled from her bag before she'd finished sitting down. She ordered coffee black and didn't touch it until it was almost cold, which he'd noticed because he'd been watching for it without meaning to. When she laughed, not the professional acknowledgement of something mildly amusing, but the actual thing unguarded, it happened fast and she recovered from it quickly, as if spontaneous joy were a minor lapse in protocol she hadn't yet decided whether to allow. He was learning to watch for that, too. The second dinner had been at a place Reid chose on Milwaukee Avenue, a narrow room with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and no pretense of being anything other than what it was, his attempt to give them something closer to level ground. Sloane had looked around when they arrived with the focused interest she brought to anything unfamiliar, and then looked at him. "You picked this specifically because it's nothing like where I'd have chosen." He confirmed it. She nodded once, sat down, ordered the special without reading the description, and said she approved of the principle. They ate for 2 hours, and the conversation moved the way conversations move when both people have decided without announcing it to stop performing. He drove home afterward and sat in the parking spot outside his building for 11 minutes before going inside, not because he needed to think, but because the thinking had already happened, and he wasn't ready to bring it indoors yet. The third time had been different because of Noah. Sloane had arrived to collect Reid for an off-site client meeting on a Thursday evening when the school pickup had landed at his apartment before the meeting had fully concluded. Noah was on the front step with his backpack and the particular alert energy of a kid who'd spotted something interesting before the adults had finished their business. Reid was still on his phone managing the handoff from the after-school program when Sloane's car pulled up. Noah watched her get out with the undisguised assessment that children apply to new people before social training teaches them to pretend otherwise. The pause before Sloane reached the step was barely visible. Then Noah, in the tone of someone conducting an interview for a position he'd already decided he might fill, "Do you know that velociraptors were actually about the size of a turkey?" Sloane stopped on the walkway, hands in the pockets of her coat. "I did not know that." "Most people don't. Movies made them way too big. The real ones were still scary, though. They had sickle claws." Noah hooked one finger to demonstrate. "For pinning prey." "That seems efficient." "Super efficient. They hunted in packs, like wolves, but smarter." He considered her for a moment with the candid appraisal of someone who hadn't yet learned to disguise it. "My dad doesn't know much about dinosaurs, but he learns." Something crossed Sloane's face that Reid, still managing his phone on the step above them, almost missed a softening so brief it was less an expression than the shadow of one there and gone before it could be examined. "That's a reasonable quality in a person," she said. Noah appeared satisfied. He moved aside to let them pass. Reid pocketed his phone and looked at Sloane and understood from the particular way she was not quite looking back at him that something had just shifted that neither of them was going to name tonight. That evening, after the meeting and a takeout dinner, all three of them ate at the kitchen table while Noah narrated an elaborate theory about whether apex predators experienced boredom. Sloane stood in the kitchen while Reid cleared plates and looked at the refrigerator, the way he sometimes looked at it himself, not examining, memorizing. The paper with the folded creases, the magnet. Her eyes moved across without stopping the way they moved across everything she was filing rather than merely seeing. She didn't ask. He didn't explain. But he caught the moment she looked, and she caught him catching it, and they both returned to their separate tasks with the awareness of two people who have acknowledged something without using any of the available words for it. At work, the distance they maintained was exact and cost him more than he'd anticipated. They had agreed on its parameters in Sloane's office the Monday after the first dinner she, behind her desk, in the version of herself that belonged to the 15th floor, laying out terms with the precision she brought to anything that mattered. Professional context, professional behavior, no personal conversations in the office, no preferential treatment, no perception of it, no margin for anyone to draw a line between a decision and what was happening between them. Reid had listened and agreed and understood the logic completely, and spent the elevator ride back to 14, aware that the logic, however sound, was considerably easier to construct than to inhabit 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, in a building where he could hear the elevator chime and wonder every time if it was her floor. He managed it. He had always been good at managing things that required him to want something and not reach for it. The Monday of the 4th week, Marin called during his lunch break. He was eating at his desk, which he always did, and she was at her bakery in Wicker Park. "I Google searched her," Marin said. "I know you did." "Reid, Beckett Hale." He set down his fork. "What about him?" "He opened a consulting firm, here, 6 months ago, positioned directly against Mercer's core accounts, mid-market financial strategy, same client profile, lower price point." The pause that followed was the kind Marin used when she was arranging facts in the order that would land most clearly. He and Sloane were together for 8 years. They ended it when she was building Mercer. He moved to the West Coast. And according to LinkedIn, he flew back into Chicago 4 days ago. Reid looked at his computer screen where the Henderson transition plan sat open and had become suddenly illegible. He thought about the first dinner the moment Sloane's phone had lit up, and she'd looked at the screen and turned it face down in one smooth motion, the fractional change in her expression. There and gone, but he'd seen it. "You're telling me as a warning," he said. "I'm telling you because you're my brother and you have that look. You're on the phone. You can't see my look. I've known your look since you were 9 years old. I can hear it." A pause. "Go in knowing the field." He went back to the Henderson plan. He read the same paragraph 4 times and retained nothing from any of them. That evening at Marin's, picking up Noah, his sister handed him a glass of water. He hadn't asked for the move she made when she was staying close without hovering, and Noah came downstairs with a drawing he'd done at school. 3 figures in front of what appeared to be a house labeled in the economy of letters that was Noah's current handwriting style. The 3rd figure had no name. It had a question mark above it rendered in careful print, the space held open rather than left empty. Reid looked at it for a moment longer than was casual. He looked at it for a moment longer than was casual and handed it back without comment, and Noah tucked it into his backpack without explanation, which was the right instinct from both of them, which required a degree of effort he was only willing to partially acknowledge. The following Tuesday was when Garrett Voss made his move. The email arrived in the board members' inboxes at 7 in the morning, sent from an address constructed to suggest a third-party compliance concern. The server header made it traceable to anyone who knew what to look for, which the IT department did in approximately 40 minutes. By 8:30, Reid had been summoned to a brief conversation with Douglas Park, the CFO, who had the uncomfortable expression of someone executing a process he found personally distasteful but professionally could not skip. The substance of the email read Calloway was under consideration for the Q4 operations lead position. Reid Calloway was in a personal relationship with the CEO. These 2 facts in proximity constituted a conflict of interest requiring review. There was a photograph attached, taken at the lakefront park 3 Sundays ago, with a long lens. Reid and Sloane and Noah between them, all 3 looking at something Noah was pointing at. From 20 feet away, it looked like exactly what it was. Douglas said the word process 4 times in 6 minutes. Reid counted them. He was told the Q4 decision would be paused pending an independent review, that this was standard, that he should take the rest of the morning if he needed it. He didn't take it. What he needed wasn't available in the building. He went back to his desk and opened the Henderson plan and closed it again. He sat with his hands flat on the keyboard and understood what Garrett had constructed, not just the email, but the geometry of it. the way it put Reid in a position where any move looked like the wrong one. Going to the 15th floor looked like running to the CEO for protection. Staying on 14 looked like having nothing to say for himself. Texting Sloane looked like coordination. Saying nothing looked like guilt. Garrett had built the trap with the specific understanding of someone who knew exactly how the pieces fit because he'd been inside the same building long enough to map it. Reid sat in it. He didn't move. He reviewed the Hargrove account numbers instead. He answered 2 emails about the Q1 projection timeline. He went to the kitchen on 13 for coffee he didn't need and stood at the window looking at the river below and thought about the way Sloane operated the HR file, the audit report compiled before Q4. Conversations started, the clean record built in advance of any vulnerability, and understood that she had seen this specific shape of problem coming before he had. The understanding didn't entirely settle what was moving in his chest. He had still spent 6 hours in a building where the trap existed without knowing whether anyone was working to dismantle it. She found him at 6:15 in the parking structure. He was at his car jacket folded over the door. She appeared from the elevator looking like someone who had conducted a full day of work after receiving information that required considerable management, which she had and had done so without letting the management show until she was somewhere it didn't have to be hidden. "I know about the email," she said. "I know you know." She stood a few feet from him in the structure's fluorescent quiet, and for a moment neither of them filled it. Reid had spent the afternoon practicing what he wanted to say and had arrived here with none of it feeling adequate. "I handled it," she said. Something in him went still. "How?" "I pulled 3 years of your performance documentation, every project, every outcome, every peer review. I had it compiled independently before Q4 conversations started specifically because I knew this was a vulnerability once our situation became known. Douglas presented it to the board this afternoon. The numbers make the argument without me in the room." She held his gaze with the steadiness she brought to things she had already made peace with. "The Q4 decision proceeds on its own timeline. I've recused myself formally from anything involving your career trajectory. Your VP handles that chain now clean and documented." Reid looked at her. "You prepared a defense file before we'd had a second dinner." "I prepared a clean record because you'd earned one, and I wasn't going to let someone use my choices to erase yours." The words were even precise, carrying the particular weight of something that had been decided long before it was said. Garrett submitted his concern through an address that IT traced in 40 minutes. Every sentence had his fingerprints. He's being managed through the appropriate channel. Managed how? Reassignment. Different division, different accounts. It takes longer than it should, but it holds. She paused. He won't be a problem. Reid absorbed the architecture of what she'd done, the advanced preparation, the recusal, the independent presentation to the board, the IT trace. All of it had happened today in a single day in parallel with whatever else the 15th floor required. He recognized the thoroughness as characteristic and also understood standing in the concrete quiet of the parking structure that there was something underneath the relief he should have been feeling and wasn't entirely. "I needed to hear it from you," he said. "Not the outcome. The fact that you were in it while I was sitting on 14 not knowing whether anyone was moving." She was quiet for a moment. The structure settled around them, the distant low frequency of the city above the concrete. "I should have found you sooner," she said. "I was managing the process, and I left you inside it longer than I should have." She said it the way she said things she meant directly without the buffer of softening language, which was how he'd learned to recognize when she wasn't performing her accountability but actually feeling it. That was wrong. He recognized this as more than an apology and more valuable than one. He put his jacket on. "Noah's at Marin's. Have you eaten?" She looked at him for a beat in which several things were decided. "No. There's a Thai place on Damon. They do takeout." They ate at his kitchen table. The conversation moved slowly, not because it was difficult, but because they were both unwinding from the day at rates that didn't match. And the ordinary physics of a weeknight dinner food table, the low lamp above the kitchen allowed for that without requiring either of them to perform calm they hadn't finished constructing. Sloane looked at the refrigerator again partway through the meal. This time she asked. Reid told her about the night Dara announced she was leaving. Not the version with retrospective meaning attached, just the facts of it. He'd needed something to do with his hands, and what he'd done was right what he was planning to want. Sloane listened without redirecting. When he finished, she was quiet long enough that he looked up. "I had a version of mine," she said. "A voicemail. The night Beckett left. He said all the right things, that he understood who I was, that he wasn't asking me to be different, that he just needed more than I knew how to give at the time." She turned her coffee mug slowly in her hands. "I kept it because it was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to me about myself. I couldn't play it again because it was also the most painful. I couldn't delete it because deleting it would have meant the 8 years were only the ending." Reid thought about how she'd described it the first night, a voice message I've never deleted and never played again, and understood she'd been holding the full account of it in reserve, waiting for a context large enough to put it in. "How long ago did you delete it?" he asked. Because she had. He could hear it in the past tense. She met his eyes. 2 weeks ago." He let that sit. Outside, the city was doing what it did in the early dark of November, pulling its warmth inward. Marin sent Noah home at 8:30. He arrived with his backpack and the overnight report, who had been difficult at soccer practice. The current chapter of the paleontology book, an unresolved question about whether sauropods exhibited herd behavior or merely tolerated proximity, and registered Sloane at the kitchen table with the specific non-reaction of a child who had been expecting something before it announced itself. He climbed into the chair across from her and unzipped his backpack and took out the drawing from 3 days ago. The 3 figures, the house, the question mark above the third. He set it flat on the table between them and looked at Sloane with the expression he reserved for things he'd decided were important enough to say directly. "I didn't know your name when I drew it," he said, "so I left a question mark, but I think it's you." Sloane looked at the drawing for a moment longer than was casual. Something in her face moved in a way that she didn't redirect. "The question mark has kind of long hair," Noah said, pointing. "Like yours. And it's taller than the other 2. You're taller than my dad. By 2 inches. That's a lot in a drawing." He seemed satisfied with this reasoning. He put the drawing back in his backpack, looked between the 2 of them. "Are you staying for a while?" Sloane glanced at Reid. He gave her nothing deliberate. She was on her own with this one. "For a little while," she said. Noah accepted this as confirmation rather than possibility, and went to change into pajamas, returning 7 minutes later with a Lego set, which he established at the far end of the table. The evening continued in the specific, comfortable density of a space that had reached the number of people it needed to feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. Reid watched his son build, and watched Sloane watch his son build, and understood that something was happening in the room that he had not engineered and could not have. At 9:15 he put Noah to bed. When he came back downstairs, Sloane was still at the table, hands around her mug, looking at the refrigerator with the expression he'd started to recognize as her private thinking face, not the analytical instrument she used in conference rooms, but the quieter version underneath it, the one that appeared when she had stopped performing and hadn't yet decided what to do with the space that left. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He sat down. "Yeah." "If Beckett Hale came back—" She stopped. Reorganized. "He's been in contact. Not for the first time in 8 years, but for the first time where I could feel there was something behind it. His firm here. The timing." She held Reid's gaze without shifting it. "I'm not telling you this as a confession. I'm telling you because the alternative is you finding out from your sister's searches, and I'd rather you hear it from me. He reached out last week. Said he wanted to have coffee. Said he'd thought about us, what we were, more than I probably knew." Reid kept his expression level and understood he was only partially successful at it. "I'm not telling you because I've done anything," she said. "Not because I'm considering anything. Because I've spent 8 years not telling people the true thing, while it was still small enough to tell without causing damage. And I don't want to operate that way with you." Reid looked at his hands on the table. Something moved through his chest that wasn't quite hurt and wasn't quite fear, and contained elements of both without being reducible to either. "I know who he is," he said. "Marin told me." "I know she did." "You knew she'd find it." "I assumed someone would." She didn't shift her gaze. "I wanted to be faster than the information." He thought about the way she operated everything. Preemptive. Everything prepared before the vulnerability could arrive unsupported. He recognized the strategy not as a character flaw, but as a survival architecture, and recognized it specifically because his own version of it looked like a list on a refrigerator he'd written and never read and never discarded, which was the same function in a different form. "Don't see him," Reid said. The words came out simpler than the feeling behind them, stripped of everything except what they actually were. Sloane looked at him steadily. "Is that a request or a requirement?" "It's what I want." He held her gaze. "You asked me 2 weeks ago when I'd last said what I wanted and I didn't have a clean answer. This is the answer." The silence between them was not empty. It was the kind that exists when two people have run out of language adequate to the weight of a moment and have decided to stay in it anyway. "Okay," she said. It was not a capitulation. It was a decision made by someone who understood the difference, and he recognized it as such, and the recognition settled something in him that had been unsteady since 8:30 that morning when Douglas Park had said the word process for the first time. She left at 10:30. He stood at the front window after her taillights disappeared and thought about what she'd said. "I wanted to be faster than the information," and understood it was also about him specifically, about choosing to tell him, while the telling was still a choice rather than a correction. He understood the impulse because he operated by the same reflex in a different direction, the one that kept things folded in places where they couldn't cause movement. His phone lit up. The number was one he didn't recognize, and for a moment he thought it was a wrong number. "This is Noah. Dad doesn't know I'm using his old phone. I just want to ask you something." "Are you scared?" "Because Dad is. I can tell. But he still keeps showing up. That's all I wanted to say." Reid stared at the screen. He looked at Noah's closed bedroom door. He looked at the old phone on the counter, the one with a cracked screen he'd kept meaning to recycle for 8 months, and understood that Noah had apparently identified it as a separate communication channel at some point without announcing this discovery. He sat down at the kitchen table. He didn't go wake Noah up. He didn't text back. He sat in the specific stillness of a house where a child is asleep and has just done something that should have been impossible and somehow wasn't, because 7-year-olds operate by a different understanding of what's available to them, and this one in particular had apparently decided that the situation required direct action and had taken it. At 11:40, his phone buzzed again. Sloane's number this time. "I've been sitting in my parking garage for 20 minutes. I wanted you to know I'm not going to have coffee with Beckett." A pause. 3 dots appearing and disappearing twice. "Also, your son texted me from what I assume is a decommissioned device. He asked if I was scared. I want you to know the answer is yes. Considerably." Reid read it twice. He sat with it. He thought about what Marin had said. "You're functional. Those aren't the same thing." And about the list he'd written on a night when keeping his hands moving was the only thing between him and the specific feeling of a floor that wasn't there anymore, and about a 7-year-old who had saved a drawing with a question mark in it against the day when the question mark would become answerable and had apparently decided tonight was that day. He typed back, "Considerably isn't a number." Sent it. The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. "No, but it's honest." Then, "Good night, Reid." And then after a pause long enough to feel deliberate, "Thank you for telling me what you wanted." He set the phone face down on the kitchen table beside the cold coffee and the Lego pieces Noah had left in a careful row for tomorrow. He sat in the kitchen in the specific silence of a house where a child is sleeping and the city is running quietly on the other side of the walls, and let himself stay inside the feeling of having said a true thing to someone who had said one back without dressing it up. It was not a resolution. It was something earlier, the moment before a conclusion forms, when the shape of it is becoming visible through the ground still shifting under your feet. He knew this feeling. He'd spent 3 years mistaking the absence of it for stability. The mistake hadn't been in the caution. It had been in calling the caution sufficient. He looked at the refrigerator from across the kitchen, the folded paper, the drawings, the soccer schedule running into December. He thought about the list inside that folded paper, the things he'd meant to want written in the one moment when writing them felt like the only available act of faith. He hadn't opened it in 3 years. He had also not thrown it away. He understood now that both of those things were true for the same reason, which was that some part of him had been holding the space open without being willing to say so. He got up from the table. He went to the refrigerator and carefully unpinned the paper from the magnet and unfolded it for the first time. He read what he'd written on the night Dara told him she was leaving the things he'd meant to want, the architecture of a life he'd kept meaning to build. He read through them and felt the specific quality of seeing something from a distance that finally resolves into what it actually is. He went to the drawer by the sink and found a pen. He turned the paper over. He wrote one line on the back in the margin below the folded crease, "New goal, stop, waiting for the other shoe to drop." He folded the paper back along its original creases, pinned it back to the refrigerator in the same position, and stood in the kitchen for a moment looking at it. Then he turned off the light above the stove and went to check on Noah, asleep on his side dinosaur pajamas, the stuffed shark tucked under one arm, his face in the unguarded version of itself that Reid found impossible to look at for very long without something in his chest becoming too large for the space available. He pulled the door almost closed. He went to his own room. He lay in the dark and listened to the city running at its nighttime frequency and thought about a woman sitting in a parking garage 20 minutes longer than necessary because she wanted to tell him something before the morning could make it easier not to. He had not had a system for this. He had not had a protocol or a contingency or a backup plan. What he had was a pen and a piece of paper with a new line on the back of it, and the specific, unfamiliar feeling of having said what he wanted to someone who had said something true back and outside the city, doing what it always did, indifferent and ongoing and entirely uninterested in whether he was ready. He wasn't entirely ready. He was going anyway. Beckett Hale called Sloane on a Wednesday morning in the second week of November. She let it go to voicemail. She listened to it standing at her office window with the city spread below her in flat gray light, his voice measured and articulate in the way of a man who had rehearsed difficult things until they sounded unrehearsed. He said he understood if she didn't want to meet. He said he'd been thinking about the way things ended and whether 8 years of thinking about it constituted a kind of answer to a question he'd been too young to ask correctly the first time. She deleted it before it finished. She called Reid instead. He picked up on the second ring. She told him what she'd done without preamble, and his end of the line was quiet for a moment before, "You didn't have to call to tell me." She said, "I know. That's why I did." Beckett appeared at the Mercer offices 3 days later anyway, which told Reid everything about the difference between a man who accepts an answer and a man who needs to deliver something before he can accept it. He came in the way people come in when they know a building past reception, with a nod that implied familiarity up to 15 before anyone had fully processed whether he'd been cleared. Patricia stepped into the hallway with the posture she reserved for situations requiring redirection, and Beckett stopped at the boundary of it and asked without apparent irony whether Reid Calloway was available. Reid came upstairs. They stood near the elevator bank with the specific clarity of men who understand exactly what they represent to each other. "I'm not here to cause a problem," Beckett said. "Arriving unannounced at a woman's workplace to find her partner is a specific kind of problem regardless of intent." Beckett absorbed this without visible reaction, which told Reid he'd expected it. "I wanted to say something to you directly rather than let it exist as subtext." He shifted his coat to his other arm. "I know her better than most people have been allowed to. I know what she looks like when she's going through the motions of something versus when she's genuinely in it." A pause. "She's in it. With you. I needed to see it in person before I could believe it, and now I have." Reid looked at him steadily. "Why does that require telling me?" "Because I spent 8 years being the reason she kept her walls up, and I'm standing here trying to figure out if anything I do differently makes that account balance." He put his coat on without ceremony. "She turned down the merger. The terms weren't right, she'll tell you that, and she'll be half correct. The other half is that taking my capital into the company she built would have meant something she wasn't willing to let it mean." He turned toward the elevator. "Don't give her a reason to rebuild what she tore down." He left. The elevator doors closed. Reid stood in the corridor and let the information rearrange itself. Sloane had told him the merger terms required sharing brand control, which was true and which he'd accepted as sufficient. It was sufficient. It was also not the complete architecture of the decision, and the piece Beckett had just supplied had a weight Reid hadn't expected to receive from that direction. He went back to the working session on 13 and said nothing about it for the rest of the day. That evening at his kitchen table he told her everything. Sloane listened with her hands around her coffee, her expression doing the careful calibration it performed when she was deciding how much of what she was feeling should be visible. "He's not wrong about the merger," she said. "I know. Bringing his capital into Mercer would have meant thinking about it every day I walked in." "I know that too." Reid looked at her. "I want to know whether you turned it down before or after his call." She met his eyes. "Before." He believed her, not because it was convenient, but because he'd learned the specific texture of her honesty, which was that she delivered things directly and didn't dress them up, and directness was its own form of evidence. "Then Beckett did the one useful thing still available to him," Reid said, "and now he's done." Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, something more structural, a load-bearing assumption quietly revised. She reached across the table and put her hand over his without constructing a reason to, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and neither of them said anything because the moment had enough weight without language added to it. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon when Noah was in the backyard throwing a ball against the fence in the repetitive, meditative way that meant he was processing something Dara called, Reid took it in the kitchen. Her voice had the quality it got when she'd been sitting with something long enough that delivering it had become more urgent than the discomfort of saying it. She told him about the engagement first. A man named Paul met at work, good and steady in the ways that mattered. She was moving to Portland in the spring. She wanted to discuss modifying the custody arrangement, shifting primary residence to Reid for the school year, extended breaks and summers with her because Noah was stable here, and she wasn't going to impose a disruption on him that served her logistics rather than his actual life. Reid said the right things and meant them, and waited because there was more. He could hear it in the pacing. "Noah told me about Sloane Mercer," Dara said. "He calls her by her first name. That's not nothing." He introduced himself to her. "I didn't get to arrange much." Also, not nothing. A pause that went long enough to mean something. "Reid, I need to tell you something, and I don't have a clean way to do it." Her voice was the most level it had been in the entire call, which was how he knew this was the actual reason she'd picked up the phone. "In the spring, after we signed the final papers, 2 people expressed interest in you, mutual acquaintances. One reached out to me first because the situation felt complicated. I told them you weren't ready. I told the second one something similar." A silence in which the kitchen rearranged itself slightly around him. "It wasn't true. I just didn't want to know what you looked like when you were happy after me. I didn't want to do the math on what that meant about my choices." Reid looked through the window at Noah throwing the ball against the fence and catching it and throwing it again, the patience of it. "You're telling me now," he said, "because Noah said you were happy. He said you smile in a way where you don't know you're doing it." Her voice had lost its evenness at the edges. "I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking you to know that the story you told yourself about those 2 years wasn't entirely accurate." He thought about the conclusions he'd drawn, that he'd become someone too careful to be interesting, too defined by fatherhood to have anything else available. He'd built routines around those conclusions and called them clarity. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "Not performed, just true." "Take care of him," Dara said. A pause. "Take care of both of them." She hung up. Noah came in from the backyard 10 minutes later with leaves in his hair and the look of someone who had finished processing and was ready to report. He climbed onto the counter beside Reid, a move that was technically against the rules and that Reid had stopped enforcing because the conversations that happened at counter height were consistently the ones worth having. "Mom told me last week she was moving," Noah said. "She said she was going to tell you today." "How do you feel about it?" Noah considered this with genuine care. "She's happier with Paul, and I'm happy here." He looked at the refrigerator, the soccer schedule, the drawings, the folded paper. "And Sloane's here." Reid didn't say anything. "Dad." Noah's voice had the patience of someone addressing an adult being slower than necessary. "I know you're going to ask her. I've known for a while. Noah, I'm not upset about it." He hopped off the counter. "She fits here. Not like she's trying to, just she does." He picked up his ball. "Also, she's learning to cook. That's a commitment." Reid watched his son disappear toward the stairs. He opened the drawer at the back of the kitchen, moved aside the takeout menus and the extra batteries, and looked at the small box he'd put there 3 weeks ago. He'd chosen the ring with the specific care he brought to things he intended to keep. Not elaborate, not performative, just honest in its proportions. He closed the drawer. Not yet. But soon. The following Saturday, Reid handled Garrett Voss. Not with confrontation that was never going to be the right instrument. The IT investigation had completed its trace. The documentation had moved through the appropriate channels, and Douglas Park had delivered the outcome in the form of a reassignment to a client account in another division, effective the following month. Garrett's desk was cleared on a Tuesday. He left without incident. Reid heard about it from Jennifer in client services, who said simply, "The numbers were always yours. Everyone who mattered knew it." Reid thanked her and went back to his work and did not think about Garrett Voss again with any particular frequency. What he thought about instead was the river. He'd been thinking about it since October, the specific stretch of the Riverwalk where he and Sloane had walked after the first dinner before either of them had named what was happening. He'd thought about it when he bought the ring. He'd thought about it when Noah, unprompted one evening while working on a Lego structure of considerable architectural ambition, had looked up and said, "You should do it somewhere that already means something, not somewhere that's supposed to mean something." Reid had stared at his son. Noah had returned to his Lego. "That's just my opinion." He'd asked Sloane the next morning while they were both moving through the kitchen in the easy, parallel efficiency they'd developed over weeks of shared mornings whether she'd want to walk the river on Saturday. She'd said yes without looking up from her coffee. He'd said he'd bring Noah. She'd said good. The Saturday was cold in the specific way of late November in the city, the kind of cold that comes off the water and means it, and the Riverwalk was theirs almost entirely. A few runners, a couple walking a dog. The city reduced to its working version rather than its performed one. Noah ran ahead, and then looped back, and then ran ahead again in the pattern he made. When he was burning energy, he didn't know what to do with, and Sloane and Reid walked at the pace of people who weren't in a hurry because the destination was already under their feet. When they reached the stretch where the water bent and the city opened up on both sides, Reid stopped. Sloane stopped beside him. Noah, 20 feet ahead, turned around and walked back with the deliberate pace of someone who had been briefed on his role and was taking it seriously. He had been briefed. The night before over dinner, Reid had explained what he was going to do, and Noah had listened with his full attention and then said, "I want to hold the box until you need it." Reid had said that was exactly what he had in mind. Noah reached into his jacket pocket and took out the small box and held it in both hands and looked at Sloane with the straightforward gravity he reserved for things that mattered. Sloane looked at the box. She looked at Noah holding it. Something moved across her face that she did not manage or redirect. Reid spoke without preparation, which was the only way it could have been honest. He told her about the list, not what was on it, but what it had cost him to write it, and what it had cost him to keep it, and what it meant that he'd added a line to it and meant the line, and what it meant that she had been the reason he'd been able to write something new. He took the box from Noah's hands. He did not perform the gesture. He just held it out to her at the level where their hands were, both of them standing in the cold river light, equal and unshielded. "I don't want another day of the old list," he said. "That's all." Sloane looked at him for a moment that had enough inside it to be several moments. Then she looked at Noah, who was watching with the focused patience of someone who had already decided how this ended and was simply waiting for the adults to arrive at the same conclusion. "Yes," she said. Clear, unequivocal, and slightly wrecked at the edges in a way that she did not try to correct. "Absolutely yes." She took the ring from the box, and he helped her put it on, and Noah said immediately that he was cold and could they get hot chocolate, which dissolved the ceremony into the ordinary in the way that only a 7-year-old can accomplish. And the three of them walked back along the river with Noah between them, cataloging the relative merits of dark versus milk chocolate with the conviction of someone who had been thinking about this for considerably longer than the walk. On the way home, stopped at a red light. Reid looked in the rearview mirror at Noah in the back seat, already back to narrating something about the ecological impact of the KPG extinction on mammal evolution. And then he looked at Sloane in the passenger seat, her left hand in her lap, and she was looking out the window at the city going by. She turned and caught him looking. She didn't arrange her expression. She just let him see it, the actual thing unmanaged, which was a woman who had spent 42 years learning to hold the good things at arm's length so they couldn't take anything when they left, now choosing not to. He looked back at the road. The light changed. 3 months later, on a Sunday morning in March, Reid woke to sounds from the kitchen. The particular sounds of someone navigating an unfamiliar process with more determination than technique. He lay still for a moment listening, and recognized the specific pattern of Sloane encountering a challenge she intended to defeat through sustained attention. When he came downstairs, she was at the stove with the posture she'd developed over several weeks of deliberate practice, the posture of someone reconciling theory with physical reality. A pan on the front burner, eggs beaten with unnecessary precision in a bowl. Noah was on his stool at the counter, watching with the expression of a consultant retained for a job that was going sideways. "You're folding too early," Noah said. "I understand the principle. The execution is the problem." "The execution is always the problem. That's why you practice." Reid stood in the kitchen doorway. Neither of them had heard him. He watched his son instruct his fiancée on the structural mechanics of scrambled eggs with the authority of someone who had standing in this kitchen, and he watched Sloane receive the instruction without a trace of condescension, taking it in with the same quality of attention she brought to things she'd decided to learn properly. The eggs were slightly overdone. Noah said so directly. Sloane agreed, plated them anyway, distributed portions without drama about the outcome, and put toast on the table. They ate. The morning light came through the window at the low angle of early spring and landed on the refrigerator, and Reid looked at it the way he hadn't looked at it in a long time, not past it, not with the careful peripheral awareness of something he was maintaining distance from, but directly. The soccer schedule. The drawings, 4 of them now in a row. The question mark figure in the earliest one, long since given a name in Noah's evolving handwriting. And the paper, its creases soft from years of handling. His line was still there, written the night the city had gone quiet, and he'd finally had enough reason to mean it. New goal stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. Below it, in Sloane's smaller, precise hand, added on a January morning when he'd found her standing at the refrigerator in the stillness of someone who had just decided something. Being here on purpose feels different than being here by default. I didn't know that until now. And below that, in green marker, the same green Noah had used for the most recent drawings. 4 words in careful, deliberate print. Reid had come downstairs one December evening to find Noah standing on his toes at the refrigerator, marker in hand, with the focused expression he wore when he was doing something he'd been thinking about for a while. Reid had watched from the doorway without announcing himself. Noah had written his line, capped the marker with satisfaction, and gone back to the living room without explanation. "We're already it." Reid had asked him about it the next morning. Noah had given him the look reserved for answers that should be obvious. "It means we're already the thing we were trying to get to. We were just the last ones to notice." Across the table, Noah finished his eggs and announced the paleontology documentary was not going to watch itself, and disappeared from the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who knows when a meal has served its purpose. Sloane picked up her coffee warm, which was a recent development, the habit of letting it go cold having quietly dissolved sometime in the month she'd been waking up here. She looked at the refrigerator. She looked at the paper the way Reid used to look at it, which was to say with full attention rather than careful avoidance. "Noah's line is the best one," she said. Reid looked at it. "He'd agree with you." She turned from the refrigerator and looked at him across the cleared table, and the ordinary morning, and the unspectacular, irreplaceable fact of another Sunday that had arrived without requiring anything extraordinary to justify it. Her expression was the private version of itself, not the public instrument she carried into offices and negotiations, but the one underneath it which had been becoming more available with a consistency that neither of them tracked out loud, because tracking it would have changed its nature. "I keep waiting for the maintenance to start," she said. "The part where you have to work at keeping something from eroding." He looked at her. "Is it starting?" She was quiet long enough that the answer was in the silence before she said it. "No." The word came out without qualification. "It just feels like morning." He understood what she meant. Not comfort in its managed form, not happiness as a project requiring oversight, just the specific, ungoverned peace of being in the right place without having to remind yourself that you are. He'd felt it before in smaller doses, usually in the doorway of Noah's room after bedtime, the kind of feeling that arrived when you stopped trying to hold the moment and let it simply be the present tense. From the living room came Noah's voice. "Are you both coming? It starts with the asteroid." Sloane raised an eyebrow at Reid. He pushed back from the table. She stood, picked up her coffee, and walked toward the living room with the familiarity of someone who knew the floor plan without thinking about it. Which floorboard to step over, which lamp needed its cord moved, how much space to leave on the couch, so a 7-year-old could fold himself in without negotiation. Reid didn't follow immediately. He stood in the kitchen for one more moment. He looked at the refrigerator, at the 4 lines in 3 different handwritings, at the drawings and the schedule, and the accumulated evidence of a life that had not turned out to resemble any version of itself he'd planned for. He thought about what it had cost to keep the list all those years without opening it. He thought about what it had cost to finally add a line. He thought about a woman who filed paperwork before asking permission and deleted a voicemail she'd been keeping for 8 years and learned to make scrambled eggs because she'd decided this kitchen was going to be hers, and she intended to be competent in it. He thought about a 7-year-old who had been bringing granola bar pieces to a squirrel that kept running and kept bringing them anyway, and who had apparently understood the conclusion of this story several months before the adults arrived there. The documentary was narrating something about iridium deposits and geological evidence, and Noah's voice came over it explaining that he already knew this part, and Sloane's voice came back, "Tell me anyway." Reid walked to the doorway of the living room. The spring light had reached the couch now, and Noah was cross-legged in the space between the armrest and Sloane's side, and she was turned toward him the way she turned toward things she was actually listening to, which was fully without the part of her held in reserve. He sat down on the other side. The couch settled. The documentary continued. Noah explained that the iridium layer was exactly the same depth everywhere on Earth that scientists found it before they understood what caused it, that the evidence of the whole catastrophe and everything that came after it had been sitting in the ground the entire time, waiting for someone to know what they were looking for. Outside Chicago was doing what it did in March, undecided the particular combination of cold and new light that meant something was coming but hadn't committed to arriving yet. By April, there would be conversations about the soccer schedule and summer plans, and a call with Marin that would begin with her saying she'd told him so, which she had and which he intended to let her say without qualification because she'd earned it. But that was April. This was Sunday morning in March, and the light was low and specific on the 3 of them on the couch, and nobody needed to be anywhere. And the story Noah was telling about the end of one world and the beginning of the next was not Reid understood only about dinosaurs. He had started a list on a bad night and kept it for 3 years without opening it because throwing it away would have meant admitting that wanting things was finished for him. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong in the specific recoverable way of someone who built their conclusions from too small a sample and then lived inside them too long. The sample was larger now. The conclusions had revised themselves. The list on the refrigerator had 3 more lines than it started with in 3 different hands, and none of them were finished. That felt in the end like exactly the right place to stop.